Yeah, there it is.
Hello, Frank.
Hello, Thiago.
So good to see you.
It's always good to see you.
So, let me briefly introduce you for those who do not know who you are. I'm Thiago Leon, by the way. I'm a student of Frank for a long time now, over 10 years. I'm also a clinical psychotherapist, but I'm not the person here that matters. Frank uh, has studied, practiced, and taught Buddhist and Shambhala meditation for 45 years. He served Chogyam-Trungpa, which is the founder of Naropa University, as the national director of Shambhala training and the resident teacher at the Berkeley Shambhala Center for 12 years. He taught at Naropa as the core faculty where I met him at the BA Contemplative Psychology program for 20 years until his retirement in 2015. And he pioneered back then the teaching of online meditation in 1998. Frank's been a psychotherapist, a life coach in private practice for the past 25 years. And in addition to working as a clinician, he continues to teach meditation widely across North America and Canada. He's written 2 books, Falling in Love with the Buddha, which is his memoirs of his experience as a student of Chogyam-Trungpa, and Bravery, the Living Buddha Within You, a text on Buddhist-Psychology and the practice of meditation itself. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you, Chogo.
It's so good that I feel honored that you've taken the time and willingness to do this like this during this time.
Well, I'm delighted that you've asked me. So let's do it.
Do it. So I've changed the view. You're on the big screen right now, at least for what's being recorded. So you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you and I have had this conversation for quite some time, and it's the notion and the proposition of mech mindfulness and the distinction of what true and authentic meditation practice, i.e. mindfulness practice, and there's a distinction in those two actually, into what is mech mindfulness. And I want to pass the puck on to you there.
Sure. I use the word mindfulness to describe how the Buddhist practice of mindfulness has been, particularly over the last few years, increasingly popularized and assimilated into Western culture, and particularly the culture of this country. It's not so much that the mindfulness that's being taught is somehow inauthentic. I think there are a number of teachers who teach it in the traditional way. And like any practice in the Buddhist tradition, it can bring some benefit to people. The larger problem is the context in which it's happening. And that is that we live in a culture where everything eventually becomes a commodity. We live in a very powerfully materialistic culture, which, by the way, during this period of the coronavirus is being challenged to its very roots. And that's a very interesting point, which is not really the subject of this conversation today, but it's definitely part of a bigger conversation about spirituality and the challenges that this country faces in terms of coming to a dead end with its materialism. So mindfulness means the mass production of meditation practice in the United States. That's where I came up with the term. And the problem with it is not so much the method itself, but the problem is the aims or the kind of underlying assumptions in which the method's being used. And what I mean by that is that if mindfulness is taken out of its original place, its sacred place within the teachings of the Buddha, within the whole path that the Buddha taught, then it becomes purely a technique which people ultimately use in a very superficial way, which is how a materialistic culture deals with everything. Everything becomes a commodity. Everything is marketable. Everything is for sale. And in fact, it's very interesting to see that there are a lot of quote unquote mindfulness teachers out there who basically are making a lot of money marketing this as a method for, living a better life, having less stress, doing better at your job, having less conflict in your relationships. All the things which in the past we've had many other so-called solutions for, these problems of modern life. And the idea that this technique is just instantly going to bring these kinds of benefits to people, I think is extremely, somewhat naive. I think on the part of some teachers, it's actually slightly cynical to think that just using this technique is going to transform people's lives in some fundamental way. Because the problem is the culture in which it's happening. It's the culture fundamentally that needs transformation. And mindfulness being taught simply as a technique to, my teacher would have said, to interior decorate your neurotic cocoon. We can unpack that later if you want, is not going to provide that sort of transformative power. On the other hand, and this brings me more to the tradition of the Buddhist Dharma, which I've been trained in since I was in my 20s. It's been 45 years now. Really wonderful and very genuine teacher from Tibet. The entire path of which mindfulness is a part does teach a kind of fundamentally transformative vision for human life. So the first point there is that mindfulness first stage, the first step in a lifelong, and indeed according to the Tibetans, a path that goes on for many lifetimes. It's the first step in kind of taking a closer look at the suffering in which we are embroiled, and for the most part unconsciously, which is one of the reasons why it's suffering, because we're not awake, we're not conscious. So mindfulness becomes the first step on that stairway, literally, that stairway to freedom. But then there are many, many other practices that come after mindfulness. We have the practice of panoramic awareness. We have the practice of insight, penetrating insight. We have the practices of loving kindness, of compassion. We have practices, particularly in Tibet, where the practitioner identifies with particular deity or a divine expression of their nature in order to let go of their neurotic mind. And then finally, we have practices in which are very simple but very, very advanced and require lifelong training. Practices of literally resting your mind in its true nature, which the Buddha taught is the definition of enlightenment. Now, what needs to be understood here is that without mindfulness as a starting point, we can't actually do all these other practices. So any Dharma teacher, certainly all the Tibetan teachers that I've ever studied with, begin with mindfulness. Because unless we can train our mind to remain undistracted on an object of attention, there's no way to go deeper or to have a deeper understanding of what the Buddha taught and what the Buddha's path to liberation actually was. So I think that's the first point, is just making a general distinction between what I refer to as mindfulness, which is mindfulness as a commodity in a materialistic culture, which doesn't.
Mick is fast food, right? I mean, that's the connotation.
It's like fast food, and like fast food, it doesn't really nourish you.
Right.
It may quench, it may quell your hunger momentarily. You might get a quick fix from it, but it doesn't nourish you. There's no nourishment in it ultimately. Now, having said this, I think it is certainly not an unqualified bad thing that more people are practicing mindfulness in our culture than did before. That's a good thing. That will have some benefit. But to the degree that it simply becomes a commodity and becomes absorbed into the materialism that has really brought us to this very desperate place in our history, it is not of tremendous benefit. It's only a kind of surface benefit for a relatively few people. Because even to say that it's gone mainstream, I would venture to say if 1 out of 100 Americans are practicing mindfulness now, I'd be amazed. I doubt it. However, but it's been marketed as if, it's sweeping the culture. But of course, everything gets marketed that way. So most of it is just kind of, a shell game.
It's a shell game, and maybe you can expand on the specificity of this in a way, because there is about, I don't know, a million. That's a hyperbolic statement on my part, but there's about a million different apps now that people can press, or there's something that has a quote unquote meditation practice in it, and there's something, at least from my point of view, and in my experience in studying with you and studying the Dharma, that misses the view, misses that the initial substantial practice of mindfulness has to be connected with a much longer view altogether. And
absolutely, well said. To expand on that a little bit, I would make a couple of points. One is, I talked before about how mindfulness is the first step in a series of disciplines that bring us finally to the kind of freedom that the Buddha experienced and that has been taught for 2,500 years. This is a very, very old lineage, and it has been tested by time and proved to be like gold, solid gold. But to go back to the context, mindfulness in the Buddhist teachings, its context is that we practice mindfulness in an atmosphere of wanting to go beyond suffering, wanting to experience happiness, which is still, now that alone is still capable of being perverted by materialism, because all of us want happiness, none of us want to suffer, and a materialistic society is constantly offering us very superficial and ultimately useless ways to do that. But the ethics of what the Buddha taught goes beyond that. It talks about wanting happiness for all beings, understanding that all beings don't want to suffer, understanding that every other being is equal to us in wanting happiness and not wanting to suffer. And when you contemplate that, even for a short time, it cuts through your artificial sense of superiority, of separation, and of indifference to the lives of others. And a materialistic culture is built upon maintaining that indifference to the lives of others, not deliberately, like, although we have some leaders now who actually deliberately are indifferent to the lives of others. Not indifferently, but because everything is about our own security and our own personal happiness, our vision is very, very small. So that's part of what mindfulness becomes caught up in. Well, this is going to make your day better. This is going to make you more successful, blah, blah, blah. That's not the way the Buddha taught mindfulness. The Buddha said mindfulness is the first step in opening your eyes to how life really is, to the fact that all of us suffer, to the reality that all of our materialistic strategies for trying to evade it or solve it are going to fail, to the fact that life is impermanent, all of us are going to die. So let's get real here. What's really going on?
right.
We are completely equal to all other beings in our condition of not wanting to suffer, of being in a body that's impermanent and is eventually going to die, and of wanting happiness. So I believe, through a lifetime of study and practice and observing truly great masters of the tradition, that there is an authentic way to engage these existential questions. Mindfulness has to be seen in the context of a whole ethics of what it means to be human, which I think I just described in the last few minutes. And also an appreciation for the sacredness of the phenomenal world, of reality. That if we see that all beings want happiness and don't want to suffer, if we could really take that in, not just about the human world, but about the entire world, or what the modern science calls the biosphere, we would not harm a single being. And we would certainly not spend all of our time and our wealth destroying the world that has given us birth and sustains our life. So this is not some sort of touchy-feely love and light view. This is a view of what the Buddha called karma, that if we soil our nest, eventually it's going to bounce back on us. And many, many Tibetan teachers, including my own, if he were still here with us, would say that the appearance of these viruses and this incredibly powerful and frightening changes in the climate, increasing lack of hospitality for human life in this world. All of these are the result of a human ethos which has forgotten the sacredness of reality and has forgotten our equality with all other life. We've lost our humbleness. And in our arrogance, we are destroying ourselves. And I think that sense of self-destruction is becoming more and more accelerated. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I just heard a great song from Leonard Cohen, and one line that stayed with me, he said, love is the only engine of survival. Mm. So the Buddha would have appreciated that.
Right. Here's let me know if the summary is correct, because a materialistic approach to mindfulness appears to sort of have embedded in its fallacy or fantasy that it's going to make you more productive, that it's going to make you an engine of a hyper-focused, super productive person that will not be distracted by their own I don't know what, and be better at participating in the machine, so to speak, whether virtual or not. And that's not how this thing was originally designed, or actually, as a matter of fact, how it works for real. Because how it works for real, right? And this is your quote, by the way. I learned this from you when you said, mindfulness practiced is a manufactured corrective experience.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's very good.
And it's a manufactured.
I actually said that one time.
You did.
That's pretty good. I like that.
That's right. It's a manufactured corrective experience that I think subdues, shall we say, like a survival complex, a neurotic complex that tries to continue, right? Because ultimately this capacity to actually take in the world is predicated on a mind or an experience of self that is constantly struggling with maintaining its identity to a certain point of view.
Excellent. Let me see if I can, you've said so much there. I don't really know how much I could add to it. I just think it's very complete. But one thing I would say is that the materialistic culture is both manipulating us and also avoiding our endless panic about whether we're going to survive. And that panic about our survival is, mindfulness gives us the first opportunity to actually be with that panic about our survival and see just how neurotic, we actually sit with it. We just sit with it and really let ourselves experience it. So that's the first point that I want to make. And for example, in this coronavirus experience, this lockdown experience, I think many people are discovering just how frustrating and how utterly bereft of entertainment it's like a cold turkey experience. You know, I'm reminded a little bit of the film The Man with the Golden Arm. Is put into a padded cell because he's a drug addict and he has to beat his heroin addiction, and he goes through days of incredible torture as the addiction begins to leave his system. Now, obviously, we're not going to have an experience that's nearly that dramatic, but we're going to have an experience of what Chogyam-Trungpa called hot boredom with no relief. Hot boredom means basically we're constantly looking for entertainment. We have an underlying level of anxiety or depression that goes on throughout the culture. And entertainment and constant distraction is our way of avoiding turning toward it and really confronting it. So the first step in a genuine spiritual path, which mindfulness, when properly understood, introduces us to, is that we have to face our minds realistically and honestly for the first time. And it's not always a pretty experience. So if we're using mindfulness just simply as a way to sort of uh, uh, put ourselves to sleep for a little bit longer and convince ourselves, oh, I've got it. I have a spiritual practice now. I'm on the right side. It's more self-deception. So I want to come back to hot boredom. Hot boredom is this constant need to fill the emptiness that we feel through entertainment. Constant entertainment temporarily fills it, then we feel empty again, and the boredom comes back. It's hot because it's like an itch. It's just, we're constantly itching. Like it's like we have an eternal allergy of anxiety and depression that needs to be filled with entertainment. What my teacher said about mindfulness practice is that it introduces us to an experience of cool boredom as opposed to boredom. And I think actually this is a very powerful point about the opportunity we have now with this lockdown. If we're actually willing to use this lockdown as an entry point into the real understanding of mindfulness, we could see over time that our hot boredom, if we're willing to be with it and practice mindfulness with it, can eventually become cool boredom. What do I mean by cool boredom? I mean that mindfulness practice is not a form of entertainment, but it is a way of being with what used to be a constant itch that we needed to scratch without scratching. In other words, to be with all the impulses that we had to fill our neurotic world so that we didn't have to actually experience it. Mindfulness is a way of turning and saying, no, I'm going to be with this and I'm going to conquer it. Now, conquer it doesn't mean make it go away, but what it means is I'm going to be with this until I can ride this energy without constantly trying to escape. And my teacher called that cool boredom. And he said it's a real accomplishment in the path of mindfulness and awareness to go from constantly needing to be distracted to the willingness to sit with the simplicity of the present moment. So within that transition from hot boredom to cool boredom, there's an implication, this courage that we're actually willing to face our mind directly. And I think that any way that mind's taught that does not tell the student, look, this is not going to be an easy thing. And in the beginning, you may at times be very discouraged and you may even feel things are getting worse in the beginning, but they're not getting worse. It's just that you're really looking at the craziness of your mind for the first time. What's that saying that you and I love so much? All the world's problems begin because a single person is unable to sit by himself or herself in a room for half an hour. That is the proper understanding of the ground of mindfulness, not some little quick fix. Okay, I think I've said enough on that subject. Thank you for your...
And very powerfully. And I think to connect, and I think to move us along, this distinction between hot boredom and cold boredom is so powerful because maybe it connects with the notion of resilience that you and I have also talked about, in the sense that, because somebody might be hearing this or something, and it's like, why is it better to be hot bored, or why is it better to be cold bored over hot bored kind of thing? But I mean, the proposition is that that itch that wants to be scratched produces such a tremendous amount of anxiety that's quite painful to sort of, and the capacity to be with that desire to scratch actually does produce a form of psychological resilience.
Very good. Yes, definitely. The capacity to be with that desire to scratch the itch without scratching it.
Yes.
Is almost, you could say, the gateway into psychological resilience. So here we have some understanding of what the deeper purpose of mindfulness is about. The deeper purpose of mindfulness is about being with oneself without moving for longer and longer periods of time, which introduces two principles which are essential to understanding mindfulness and which are essential to the whole Buddhist path. The first, distraction, which is that we learn how to be in the present moment of our life without constantly looking for an escape. We learn how to keep coming back to the simplicity of whatever is occurring. Sometimes it may be pleasurable, sometimes it may be painful, but the resilience is in not chasing after what's pleasurable and avoiding what's painful, but sitting through both. That's part of the resilience. So the non-distraction, and then the other quality is gentleness and loving kindness toward oneself. The Buddha taught that before we can express love and compassion for other beings, other people, for the world, we have to feel it for ourselves. It's very interesting that many Tibetan teachers have been struck by how unfriendly Western students are to themselves. Almost shocked by it, the amount of kind of self-hatred. And I would say it's not so much that Western students as human beings just don't have that capacity that perhaps Tibetans did, but that we have grown up in a culture where external reference points for whether we have any value are so powerful that we have stopped learning how to trust our own inherent.
I lost you there. You made a very important point. Are you back? Yeah, there you go. You froze for a second. I just want to prompt you again that we live in a culture where the external symbols and the external, I don't know, the images are so powerful that people stop trusting their inner reference.
Absolutely. That's it. And also, you know, this is true for men and women, but you particularly see it, for example, in the entire industry of making women feel bad about themselves and telling them all the things that they can buy and get, and et cetera, right. That'll make them feel better. Those external reference points, this is the whole strategy of a materialistic culture, is to keep making you feel inadequate, keep holding out to you some utterly superficial and unreal image of what it means to be a happy person, a fulfilled person, a successful person, and we're getting those messages from the time that we're children, and the entire culture is reinforcing them. Then we are obviously going to feel extremely inadequate, and that inadequacy, a hallucination coming to us from the intragenerational. If I could indulge our psychological language a little bit. It has nothing to do with fundamental nature. And this is why my teacher, he was so revolutionary. He said the purpose of mindfulness and awareness and all the other practices ultimately is to rediscover our own inner basic goodness. And confidence builds, and it can only build through experience. It can't build through reading about it, talking about it, trying to imitate it. And this is why meditation is so powerful. We have to actually do it. And when we do it, and we begin to develop confidence in this inner goodness and strength that we have, then we have the resilience to deal with any situation. And our life changes. Our life, it becomes very, very different. So the key word here in this part of the conversation is confidence, enlightened confidence. The reason I studied with my teacher and his teachers is because of their confidence about their own basic goodness. And when you see that in another person, and you see it demonstrated day after day in every situation, you develop confidence in what they're teaching, and you want to follow that example. And that's kept me going for 45 years. So inner confidence as opposed to external hallucination about what it means to be a successful person, a happy person, a good person. Materialism will never give us satisfaction there. It's designed not to. It's a conspiracy to keep us fundamentally depressed, anxious, and needing to scratch the next itch. There's no end to it. There's no end to it. He saw it in his own culture. Okay, that's long enough, I suppose.
It's quite no, it's incredibly powerful. You're breaking up in and out sometimes.
Yeah,
the message.
Sorry about that.
No.
Go ahead.
The message gets delivered, I think, quite powerfully, because I think your, basic goodness, I think, is a concept or an understanding, a frame that can be elaborated in all sorts of ways. But I think you're fundamentally saying that the confidence of sitting with that awareness that catches that there's more inside, and that is not sort of caught on, because to not be caught on by the external hallucination is not as simple as it sounds. You need to practice.
I didn't say it was simple, and it's certainly not easy. It's not easy. That's why meditation is a warrior's path. It requires patience, requires courage, it requires the willingness to really stay with it, and a certain level always of new discovery, which may be preceded by a lot of uncertainty and fear. But every time you stay with the fear and the uncertainty and move through it, you move to a deeper level of confidence. This is the whole mechanism of how the warrior's path unfolds. This is what my teacher taught all of us, and what he demonstrated every day of his life. It's the real Dharma. It's the real thing. It's deep. It's uncompromising. It's completely authentic. It cannot be faked, and it cannot be imitated. And, each of us has to do it ourselves.
Right.
Each of us has to do it ourselves. The Buddha said, let me finish this one quote. Very famous. The Buddha said to his monks when he was about to die, he said, "Now, monks, I'm about to die. This body is going to become a corpse. Because as I have taught you from the beginning, everything in the world is impermanent. Everything's impermanent. The end of every meeting is parting. The end of all life is dying. And just as I told you then, you have to work out your own freedom with great exertion. It's completely up to you. Be a light unto yourselves. I cannot do this for you." And this is a very, very important understanding of why Buddhism is a non-theistic discipline. There's no savior. There's just the teacher points you in the right direction, and then it's totally up to you.
I think this might be a very powerful segue to introduce Dorje Trollo, which is someone, well, I don't know if calling it's someone is accurate, but it's sort of, usually when people think of Buddha, or certainly it's part of the symbolic archetype of Buddhism in the collective, that, there's the image of the sitting peaceful Buddha and this kind of thing. And Dorje Trollo is not that Buddha. He is a Buddha, but there's something quite unique about him. And I don't know, my sense of it, and if you can tie that into your elaboration, is that he's the most accurate form for what's required right now in the world.
Yes, I think that's the case. So just a little more context for what Tiago's talking about. Dorje Trollo is the wrathful form of Guru Rinpoche. Guru Rinpoche was the teacher who brought Buddhism to Tibet 1,200 years ago, and has been regarded ever since by the Tibetan people as the second Buddha, equal to the Buddha in realization. Now, one of the things that was really interesting and kind of unique about Guru Rinpoche is that it's said that he would take different forms or manifestations according to the situation. And in fact, there were 8 of them, and we don't have time to go into them at all, obviously, although it's extremely interesting, and you can Google it and read about it. You can Google anything now. The eighth and last form was called Dorje Trollo, and Dorje Trollo was the wrathful form of Guru Rinpoche. So just as Chago was saying, traditionally the Buddha is represented as a monk, and he's represented as extremely peaceful. And he's represented somewhat as being outside of what we would call the materialistic or mundane world. In other words, from that monastic place, sort of above and beyond the world, he gives his teachings, and we're invited to join him. Well, I think that part of the issue now is that the world has become, the materialism has become so powerful in the world, and the world is so hypnotized almost universally by materialism and by what is increasingly a very virulent, toxic form of materialism, full of arrogance, full of indifference to the suffering of others, full of growing inequality between those who have and those who do not have, and kind of willful destruction of the world that we all share and that we all depend on. And that what Guru Rinpoche realized 1,200 years ago, and what my teacher realized during his lifetime, is that the energy of materialism now requires a more, what shall we call it, a more radical energetic response as an antidote. Not a peaceful image of the awakened state, but what's called a wrathful image. Now, the word wrathful needs to be understood. Wrathful doesn't mean angry in the neurotic sense. So it's not like a Buddha who's running around being angry at everything. No, it has to be understood.
Yes.
If there's neurotic anger, that is probably the biggest obstacle thing of Buddha. It's a very toxic neurotic state, the worst. So wrathful doesn't mean angry, but what wrathful means is directly confronting the arrogance and confusion of materialism at its most barbaric and most kind of powerful manifestation. It's directly confronting that and basically saying no to it. So, and it's called wrathful compassion. In other words, compassion comes first, because the Buddha is always compassionate. But then instead of being a peaceful expression of compassion, it's a wrathful expression. Wrathful means the Buddha, you could say the mind of the Buddha is utterly, without neurosis, outraged by the grossness of the materialistic insanity. Just completely outraged. Now, the way this manifests, the way wrathful compassion manifests in a teacher is what's called crazy wisdom. And we don't really have time to go into this in tremendous detail, but the point of crazy wisdom is that when a Buddha, an enlightened teacher, has enough confidence in the awakened state, then every encounter with that person, no matter what, no matter how crazy, no matter how neurotic, every encounter with that person is going to give you an opportunity to wake up. That person, even though their actions may appear to be outrageous, energy around them may appear to just be very intense, they're always coming from a place of stillness, peace, openness, and compassion in the state of being of the teacher. And that's what a wrathful Buddha means. It has the Buddha quality. It never departs from peace and compassion, but it acts in whatever way is appropriate with every situation. And that's what's called for. I think my teachers certainly believe that that's what's called for in our age, that kind of wrathful compassion.
Is it correct to understand it? Because you know the notion of a wrathful Buddha, right? And it's because the toxicity of the situation, the toxicity of the psychological environment is so neurotic and confused. I mean, that is the essence of materialism. I love what you said earlier, that it sort of materialism from that point of view is doomed to fail because it keeps trying to usher us into the next thing, that's going to finally get us there, or whatever.
Yes.
And that we currently live in a world and in a state that has become sort of, I mean, from social media to, I mean, the way things are, it's sort of, I mean, things are upside down, particularly right now, as you anybody's looked at the news in the world. I mean, things are upside down, and the way that we've gone about constructing civilization is self-evident to those who want to see it. I mean, the inequalities, the sort of the rape of the environment, and what this notion of eternal productivity is doing to us. And the wrathful component enters there, right, into seeing both how much pain there is in all that, and then saying no to that.
Saying no to it, but respecting the energy of it. You see what I'm saying? There's tremendous energy behind this kind of toxic, extreme samsara that you just described. And the thing about a wrathful Buddha is that a wrathful Buddha is willing to engage with whatever energy is happening out of the confidence of resting in the awakened state. So no matter how extreme the situation is, a wrathful Buddha is willing to go right into the middle of it and engage with it because of his or her compassion. So that's why wrathful can never be separated from compassion, because the ultimate aim of everything that a Buddha does is to relieve the suffering of sentient beings. That's the only motivation. There isn't any other motivation. There isn't any other reason for a Buddha to be in the world except to help others go beyond their suffering. And so a Buddha will enter, in this case, and when we're talking about wrathful Buddha, he or she will enter any situation, no matter how toxic, no matter how frightening, and engage it. And at the point of crazy wisdom, the engagement isn't even deliberate. In other words, the Buddha is so awake that whatever is happening, the response will be completely spontaneous and natural and in accord with the situation. There's no strategy. There's no strategy. It's always spontaneous. And that is the hallmark of a completely awakened being, and a being who has complete confidence in their wakefulness.
Right. In other words, it's almost like the crazier it is, the more motivated or the more reflective their awakening becomes, or sort of their confidence in being able to deliver an accurate, rather than being taken by the toxicity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's no strategy. In other words, there's so much confidence that the Buddha enters into those situations with complete openness and total trust that the response will be accurate, because you're not afraid of the energy. You're not afraid of the energy. And I think, coming back to your original point of this whole part of the conversation, the limitation of the archetype of a Buddha as a peaceful monk sitting somehow outside of the world's problems and its energies and its craziness. The problem with that is that it's as if the Buddha is sitting on the sidelines rather than actually on the field. So for a Buddha to be on the field at this level of what my teacher would call super samsara, in other words, extreme toxic materialism, for a Buddha to engage it, to be on the field, on the gridiron of samsara, the wrathful compassion is absolutely necessary. It's like it's the last resort of a Buddha. Yeah. So wrathful compassion is the last resort of the lineage of awakened ones. It's the final weapon. It's the final arrow in the quiver. Yeah. And so I think that's where we are now. Anyway, we've just begun to scratch the surface. I'm really enjoying our conversation very much.
Yeah, I know, and we're an hour into it, and so
yeah,
maybe this has become sort of an intro to more talks that we can do also. But I just want to say that Yeah, because we're talking about I think this conversation ends up, and maybe we can pick this up at some point, but it opens up to I think a mixture of confidence and vulnerability. And
Oh, lovely, lovely. Say a little more about that. Yeah.
well, I think the notion that, I mean, right. I mean, I'm no Buddha, that kind of thing, obviously, but very human. And but the notion of sort of having an archetypal awakened being that is in the trenches with us rather than away in the mountain, so to speak,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is
yeah. Yeah,
that
good.
and
Good.
sort of fighting for sanity and
Mhm.
enlightenment. It's an incredibly, and that's possible in the middle of toxicity. But here's the thing: is that uh, vulnerability is an interesting topic to expose, because it sort of, one has to go through a process of, I think, unmasking one's desired version of self, right? To be sort of, to be a little psychoanalytic, it's sort of like the idealized self versus the real self.
Mhm.
And you have to be vulnerable between the distinction of those two things, and that can be quite a fall, right? I mean, a lot, I know as a psychotherapist, you know this in a way, is sort of that distinction between who I think I want to be and who I really am.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know why I'm doing this, because they can be like that, but uh, that's a pretty big problem. And I mean, to sort of
It's a big
resolve.
problem. It's a big problem in the beginning. And that's what we were talking about when people feel like things are getting worse. It's because, as you said right there, the gap between our idealized wish about ourselves and who we really are, when we start to really look at our mind, the gap is almost unbearable to witness. But over time, we begin to realize that that idealized notion was a complete fantasy to begin with. That's the external kind of mirrors that the society is giving us for who we should be. We have to actually we have to cold turkey with those. We have to give them up. And over time, we will happily give them up, because we're going to give them up in exchange for a deeper and a more inward and a more authentic experience of who we are. And the more we have that experience, the more we realize there's no going back. We don't want to go back. It's just going further and further, deeper and deeper into that
Which is
experience.
where the
And so,
confidence comes in.
but also the vulnerability. And so I wanted to say a little bit about you're using the word vulnerability.
Yes.
Vulnerability in materialistic culture is regarded as a weakness. Very important to really see that, when we're using language. If the culture is based upon endless competition, survival of the fittest, then any kind of vulnerability is regarded as weakness. We're seeing this at the highest levels of our country right now. We're seeing it in the grossest possible way. That's all I'm going to say about that. I have no interest in spending another moment talking about that level. But the vulnerability within meditation practice is inseparable from the strength and the confidence. In other words, the vulnerability becomes a kind of tenderness that we develop toward ourselves, and a growing tenderness and sensitivity, which is part of compassion for other people. And that combination of this kind of powerful, fearless confidence about who we are, and this vulnerable and sensitive appreciation for the impermanence of life, for the fact that brings a deeper and a more human kind of feeling to the confidence. And that's a very different kind of vulnerability. It's not weakness at all. It's actually part of the warrior's strength. It's both fearless, confident quality and this very soft and vulnerable quality, both of them. So that's an entree into a whole other discussion, but I think it's important to clarify what we mean by vulnerable, as opposed to the conventional use of the word, which it doesn't give it its due. If I may say so, I'd like to stop here. I'm kind of a little tired, and I'm thinking also that if we're going to give people, maybe do this more than once, and make it available to people, that an hour seems like enough for people to chew on.
Yes, I
Don't
want
you agree?
absolutely. You took my words from me. So,
Yeah.
is there anything you want to sort of close off with for now that you?
I guess, yeah, I want to talk about confidence and vulnerability in terms of, my own experience of what's happening now. I read the paper every day. I hear from my friends. I know how much suffering there is right now, and I feel it all the time. But I also feel that this is a tremendous opportunity for people if they have the right sort of karmic disposition, so to speak, to turn toward the practice of Dharma, the practice of warriorship, of working with one's mind and extending compassion to other people. It's an opportunity to have a much bigger view of what is the real purpose of your human life now. So you could almost call this a compulsory retreat. We've been pushed into retreat against our will. And rather than retreat feeling like a prison, retreat could feel like a tremendous opportunity for growing and for opening and for seeing a much bigger vision of reality and of the possibilities of our life. And I wish that for everyone, even though I know not everyone is going to be able to take advantage of it. That is there. All the great masters at some point in their life went into retreat in order to deepen their confidence out onto the battleground of samsara to help others. And this is an opportunity for us to do it. So I hope you're doing it.
Yes, sir. Frank, I love how you said that with, with the Federer sort of, and the just do it.
Just do it. That's it.
Frank,
by
thank
the
you.
way, Nike stole that from my teacher.
Yes.
They did. Nike came along after he taught us. He would just say to us, after a while, he said, "You can't talk about this. Just do it."
Thank you so much, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you, Thiago. Okay.
Okay.
See you soon, my friend. Bye.